Alex, what's going on, man?
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on, Will.
Yeah, appreciate you coming on the second time. Anybody who knows me knows I'm not good with technology. And so we originally had a episode a while ago, but then, I'm not very good with technology. So Alex was kind enough to come on again. So just like I asked all guests, Alex, can you just give us a little rundown about yourself, how you got into the game, and then how you eventually got into coaching?
Absolutely. So I'll try and keep this to a minute or less. I grew up in the United Kingdom in a town called Guildford. Started playing basketball from a young age, 12 years old. Started coaching when I was 14, working just with other younger kids at my school. I started my own club in England at 16 years old. We became one of the biggest youth programs in the UK. I had a team of 5 full-time coaches, and quite a few of our kids went on to play for national teams. So I did that while I was studying at high school and at university. I was running that. Did history at University of Nottingham. When I graduated at 21, I started working with the NBA Europe, which was an amazing experience. Worked 3 years in the basketball operations team, working on a number of NBA programs like Junior NBA, Basketball Without Borders, all over the world. That was 3 years. Spent last year in Belgium as technical director at EA. Then I teamed up with Chris Oliver of Basketball Immersion, just over a year ago now. And I run Immersion in addition to my work here in Italy with college basket, where I serve as player development coordinator, and I'm also head coach of a new program, a prep team that we have starting next year.
And so can you tell us a little bit about college? That's like a youth academy there in Italy?
Yeah, so college is a basketball club. Great history in Italy, produced a lot of top players who play in like the Italian top professional leagues. And college has really, really been growing over the years. And now we have a number of really intriguing, exciting prospects, especially in our under 16 and U18 teams. So our goal with them, our mission statement is to develop them to play professional basketball, but in a holistic manner where we prepare them for not just basketball, but life. So obviously the work here is I get to work with these guys every day, running their player development small group sessions. So it's really fun just having an impact on their future, and really just having a chance to develop relationships that really go far greater than just being on the court.
Nice. So since we both work with young people, and of course you have a long background of working with youth, how do you go about making the practice dynamic and fun, and therefore engaging for the youth player, but at the same time have the ability to teach them important basketball concepts at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it starts with you as a coach, and I think just having a sense of humor and being fun to be around is critical. And that's actually kind of when I look at other coaches that I want to work with, or for instance the coaches that I've recruited here next year to work on the prep team with me. The number one thing is, are they someone who's fun and who it's fun to be around them every day for hours every day, especially during a long season. So I think it starts with you as the coach. And if you have like that sense of humor and that personality, it comes it's very easy when it comes to the practice session. Having said that, in terms of just the practice environment, to me, I like to create a really joyful environment. So I play music during the sessions. I crack jokes. But then obviously the practice itself is fun. And that comes down to practice design. If you're a coach that does a lot of traditional hand-me-down methods like 3-man weave, zigzag drill, it's probably not going to be very fun. Right. But obviously, for a lot of the coaches now who are familiar with more of a games-based approach, I think if you do this stuff in your practice, it's naturally going to be a pretty fun practice for the kids.
And anybody out there who doesn't follow Alex, I highly recommend you follow him on Instagram and Twitter. He's just got some of the best stuff out. Alex, what is kind of, would you say generally, the age where an athlete starts to have that concentration and the desire mainly to be able to delve deep into basketball concepts because they want to get that much better. Again, everybody's different. Everybody matures at a
Yeah.
different age. Everybody has different expectations, whether they just want to do it for fun or whether they want to do it for the rest of their life. In general, where do you see that little age gap in order to be able to delve deep with them?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I think, like you said, every kid is different, and it's a lot of the science and evidence in it. I mean, yes, we know that focusing on basketball from a very young age and only basketball is not a good thing. The evidence, it's not completely conclusive, because you take players like Tiger Woods,
Right.
who just focused on their sport, golf, from an extremely young age, and they're really successful. So there's not like a definitive piece of evidence which I can point to on this. I do think playing multi-sports is important, and I wouldn't want a kid to just focus on basketball from like 11 or 12. I think what we have here is pretty good, with the under 14s practice 3 times a week so that they can still do other sports. But then the best under 14s also have an opportunity, like 2 or 3 of them, to play up in 15s and get 4 a week. And it's typically those ones, like you say, who are the more serious, dedicated players. And they know that, you know, basketball is their number one sport. 2 of them have brothers who are professional players, so they're kind of in basketball families. So I think, like you said, it depends. I think you want to be careful force feeding only basketball from a young age. And I think you have to let it kind of happen naturally. And if a kid wants more basketball and they take it seriously, I think it becomes pretty evident. And then, of course, you can provide that with them. You can provide them with that as a club or organization.
Cool. Now, I would say for the most part, Alex, that a lot of your teaching is a little bit different from a lot of the traditional approaches that we use to teach the game. I know that if you asked me a while ago, why do you teach shooting like this? Or why do you teach the three-man weave? Well, a lot of coaches, including myself before, would have said, well, this is how I was taught, right? But you take a little bit of a different approach, Alex. Can you tell us a little bit about constraints-led approach? What does that mean? And give us some examples of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's funny because when I was coached completely traditionally, and it was actually that which I remember as a 16-year-old player being in a practice once and absolutely hating it. And that was just when I was getting interested in coaching. And I actually remember saying to myself, I will never put kids through these same things that I'm doing right now.
Wow. Okay. Cool.
And then it was funny because when I ran my club in England, we did not do things traditionally. It was very different, but it was definitely not games approach CLA. We had some good bits of games approach, but I didn't completely know the theory and all of this. Like, I would do good one-on-one, small-sided games, but I wouldn't really know it. And I'd still did way too much 1-on-0. But it was fun 1-on-0, you know? So when I started with the NBA, that's when I really started getting into the science. And I started reading a lot of the studies, a lot of the books available. And I mean, my NBA years were so fun. I had the best team to work with, but we had some very fiery, passionate dinners where, you know, I would be debating these topics, and, you know, they would be saying like, oh, how can you not like 3-man weave? It's a staple. And it was actually really good for my coaching, because I had to really have reasons for why I believe in these particular things. And during my NBA years, I'd say I saw a lot of very traditional coaching. And even though these are NBA coaches who I really, really, really respect, I just believe that even that time as a like 21, 22, 23-year-old, I knew there was a better way, which would be more effective. And I kind of made it my mission to try and make this way, which I wanted to make this way more known and more accessible to other coaches, so that, you know, in my future, hopefully, this way of coaching will be more common in the NBA than some of the traditional stuff we're seeing now. So I think when we look at what constraints-led approach is, it's simply the idea that the interaction of different constraints lead to an athlete or a person being able to develop skills. And those 3 constraints, especially, are 1, environmental. So that could be the country that they go up in. For instance, maybe it's a basketball country, maybe it isn't. So obviously if it's a country like Serbia, that's going to have an impact on their skills versus maybe growing up in the UK like me, where kids practice twice a week.
Right.
You also have your individual performer constraints. So that's things such as height, wingspan, perceptual skills, fatigue. All of those have a big impact on an athlete. And then the last one is task-specific constraints. And those are the ones which coaches can control the most. That's actually what the players are doing in the practice. And that is where coaching with small-sided games and applying, manipulating constraints, just space, number of players, what the rules of the game are. It's when you combine all those three things together, then that's what leads to different behaviors emerging.
Really cool. So if you take a more traditional approach, I'm thinking about this in terms of
Sure.
the traditional basketball realm. You have a specific skill like shooting, right? I think we could both agree that everybody has their different method of shooting, depending on their experiences, depending on, again, where they're from, depending on their anatomy, depending on their anatomical restrictions, all that kind of thing. How can you use a constraints-led approach to teach something as specific and unique as shooting?
Absolutely will. So, I mean, first, when we look at what the traditional approach to coaching is, it's essentially coaching as you were coached. Typically, that means former players, a lot of us obviously as coaches used to play. So it's basically that and hand-me-down coaching methods where just ideas are passed down from generation to generation without people thinking, can this be done differently? And that's why we're in the situation we're in now, where a lot of celebrity famous coaches are doing things which people see them doing and saying, oh, because so-and-so is doing it, I've got to do it. But it's like those coaches are winning not because of those drills, in spite of those drills. So when we do look at something like shooting, a constraints-led approach would mean, we're not specifically going to be teaching techniques. Let's take a youth player. We're not going to be teaching an 11-year-old how to shoot and give them an idealized movement pattern and say, this is how I want you to coach. Because I've seen that done, and it's like coaches trying to get all 12 players to shoot exactly the same way. But all 12 of those players are extremely different. Some have different eye dominance, some have different limbs, some have different sizes, different coordination levels. Every player is completely different. So the idea with CLA is that players will self-organize and figure out the most effective way of shooting specific to those performer constraints that we spoke about. Now, this is where the environmental constraints are critical on shooting, specifically in regards to equipment and making sure younger players have 8-foot baskets and a smaller ball. Because obviously if it's a 10-foot size 7 and it's like a 10-year-old shooting, they're going to self-organize differently and develop bad habits through achieving the task outcome of scoring on the 10-foot hoop.
Right.
So the idea is that with CLA, we would not be teaching implicitly from that young age. And what I would do is, for instance, instead of saying, all right, this is how I want you to shoot, I'd give them the task outcome. It would probably be some type of 1v1 or something at that age where there's a decision of whether to shoot or pass it or drive it. And then when we are shooting, I would use more external cues. I use this idea of Brad's from Sefu Bernard. So Sefu used to work with the Raptors, and now he's director of dev for the Mystics. So Brad stands for back, rim, and down. So instead of just making shots, it's got to be a Brad. And it's all based on the science. It actually comes from a Maverick shooting coach. Can't remember his name, but really, really good stuff. So instead, they've got to make a Brad. And that's an external cue to shoot with optimal arc. So instead of me saying, all right, bend your knees, do all this stuff, they will naturally self-organize to achieve the outcome of scoring with a Brad. Now, this is important. Having said that, shooting is probably the one area of the game where I am not entirely CLA approach. And the reason for that is I believe shooting is a really, really complex motor skill, and the slightest kind of error can lead to a shot not being accurate. And that's where, when it comes to CLA, I would start to error detective shooting when kids get to like 14. And it's just different for every player, but you can see obviously when there are some things which are not quite right. Now, things, I'll be honest, with me, it's typically the start and the end of the shot. Things in the middle, like elbow and angles, I do not care about. I really don't. I think it makes no difference. But I would error detect for shooting and do more traditional 1-on-0, but it would be randomized. So maybe we're changing location on every rep, changing range. We're aiming to get brads, and we're shooting with purpose. You know, we're not just shooting for the hell of it. So that's where it's the fine line between, in my opinion, I think CLA, some of the leaders in the constraints that approach world, the academics, have become a little bit too radicalized. And for me as a coach, it's critical to combine your own experience with the empirical science and evidence which exists. And for me, that means, yes, I am probably 90% of my practice is CLA, but then I see a great value in the 10% of the stuff where it's just doing other things, especially when it comes to shooting.
Yeah, that's great. So when I listen to what you're saying, Alex, the traditional phrase of repetition is the mother of all skill may not, I mean, it's definitely important. That's not what we're saying, but what we're saying is it might be a little bit more abstract, it might be a little bit more complex than that. It might be the quality of the repetition over the sheer volume.
100% well. So what I say is, do not use that phrase, repetition is king. Replace that with a phrase by the Soviet neuropsychologist Nikolai Bernstein of repetition without repetition. And Bernstein said that in 1967.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly come out since yesterday. He's been saying that that phrase has been known for a very, very long time. So it's, yes, we want the repetition, but every rep should be slightly different.
Right. And if we are going to shoot, and I think like what I can say is, after learning from Alex, not that you're not shooting 1-on-0 ever, it's not that you're forbidden to shoot that, but what we're doing is we're trying to build what Mike McKay would call the 2 C's of comfort and confidence, which is also very important when it comes to shooting. So those 2 things put together probably would lead to very good results. So okay, we're talking about shooting. Let's talk about something that's not, that someone might not pick up by themselves. Okay, like I'm just gonna throw this out there, Alex, like a stride stop. I mean, there might be people around the world who can pick this up, but very honestly, for the population that I work with, I rarely see someone be able to do it just on their own. This is just my experience, right? So a stride stop basically is, I'm dribbling with my right hand to the basket, and I stop with an outside inside stop and then go up. Okay, and biomechanically, there's a lot of advantages to that, and there's a lot of awesome ways that you can recruit ground reaction force and impulse without going into too much science. But basically, my question is, Alex, is if there's a technique or a movement that's not often grasped without any coaching, how do you go about using a CLA approach to teaching movement as well as basketball and skill?
Great. So what I would do, I love the specificity of this. It's great. So, and it's getting me thinking. So I would do a 1v1, and to begin with, I would give probably a small advantage, because if it's a big advantage, they're not going to need the stride stop. They'll just be able to probably go 1 step and, normal 1-2 and finish. So I'd give some type of small advantage, and that would probably be like a static start. Let's say the offense with the ball on the left 45, and the defense on their inside hip. So it's a small advantage, their level. The offense can go whenever they want, and it's a live 1v1. So I'm setting up a small-sided game, a 1v1, which is going to lead to opportunities for action, otherwise known as an affordance, for players to potentially use the stride stop or another finishing move. Because it's decision making. A lot of coaches really get decision making confused. Decision making is not saying, if the defender is hit, you must do this.
Right.
Because, all right, there are situations where I am explicit like that. Say a pick and roll on a short roll. With my under 16s recently, there's a short roll. Most of the time, unless two defenders really are pulled in, we will ghost cut the corner and play off that. But still, then I don't know what decision is going to come after that. So you can have automatics in an offense, but when it comes to teaching, these things in practice, you can't say, all right, if the defender does this, you must do that, because they could do another solution, like maybe they could do a spin move, and that could work. So it's this, the idea of decision making is it's like something slightly different or a new solution could emerge each time. You don't want to control it too much. So anyway, going back to this 1v1, what I would hope to see in that game would be maybe some players use some stride stops. And if they don't, what I'm going to do then is constrain it more heavily, where I'm going to use guided defense, and I'm going to guide the defense. So what was probably happening before, because it was completely live, would be the defender is probably going to do something slightly different every time. Like maybe they're going to try and wall up, sprint, and complete a cutoff. Maybe they are going to ride the hip, which is going to be the more common decision cue for using that stride stop. Or maybe they're going to slightly trail them if the offensive player gets some separation. So what I'm going to say then is the defender is going to be scripted in terms of they can only ride the hip. So I want them to really ride the hip of the offensive player and push them. Now, this, I'm hoping, is going to nudge the offensive player even more to using a stride stop. Now, if they don't, it's great. They probably won't. A lot of players still won't be able to do it. That's normal. But now at least they understand the situation and they're probably having difficulties. And now as a coach, I would step in and do a debrief. And I'd probably do something like this. I'd be like, all right, guys, bring it in. You got 30 seconds with the person next to you. I want you to talk about what problems you're finding for the offense in this game. And then after 30 seconds, I'm going to be looking for answers. That's what I would say. So then they know that they've got to get something good ready to debrief to the group. Then we do our debrief. I'll do agree, build, challenge, Mike McKay stuff. Then after that, we would reach the conclusion that we are having difficulties finishing against a defender when they're aggressively on our hip. So now I can suggest the stride stop as a solution. And ideally, what would have happened is a player that would have done it, I will reference them. So say one player did it in that 1v1, I would be like, remember that time Mattia used this stride stop and it was a really good solution. So now, Mattia, we're going to look at that move you used and we're going to look at ways we can add that to our arsenal if we're in this potential situation. So now we started with the small-sided game. Now I might teach a little bit, Will. And I might do some traditional for 2 minutes where I'm just like, all right, guys, but it's still random. It's probably not blocked unless they're really young kids. Otherwise, I would do it blocked. So I'm just going to say, all right, guys, you're going to dribble around the half court. And every few dribbles, I want you to land on your outside, inside, and freeze, changing hands every time. So all they're doing, it's random practice. It's not random, but it's variable, but it's not fully random. But it's variable because it's not always in the same location. So then I'm going to make it more random by having them dribble around the court, but then finish on one of the baskets using their stride stop. But every approach is slightly different. Then I might go scripted, not live one-on-one. So we're back to the same situation we had before. Offense is on the left 45, defense is there, but the defense is scripted and they're not live. I just want them to be there as a body, but not try and block the shot. And now the offense has to use their stride stop and finish away from the defender. And this is the biggest problem with all these player development coaches doing 1-on-0. There is zero context. So even just putting a defender there who is not live, well, now players understand where to put the ball, where they have to protect it, how they've got to leverage themselves into the defender. So that is how I would teach something. It would probably take 15 minutes to do all that. Then I go back to the 1v1. And then I'm looking for if that stride stop can be retained in that situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for me, it completely makes sense. It's because I'm thinking about how I do it. What I can add is a discussion with a partner. I think that's so key because it basically reinforces, well, it does a couple things. It reinforces what I just learned, but then I can also hear it from a different perspective. And
yes.
I follow a guy called John Kessel, who's actually in volleyball, in USA volleyball. And he mentioned he mentioned that one of the teams that he saw that was an unbelievable volleyball team was from Thailand. And one of these Thailand teams, the main way that they coached was that the older kids coached the younger kids. And it was such a good way to reinforce learning for the older kids, but at the same time, it gives them an opportunity to bond and see other perspectives. So I just going back to what Alex was talking about, it's interesting because I would say the quote unquote traditional approach is we start with a movement. We start with this finish, the spin finish, the Euro step, the whatever, like there's a million of them out there. But instead, Alex starts with the context. So you start with the situation, appreciating that everybody has different perspective. Everybody is a different height. Everybody has different abilities. Everybody has different, we can go on and on. And then once the athlete has the context and the situation down, then we find what's the best approach for them.
And Will, I just build on that because that's a great summary.
Yep.
I think as well, take that stride stop example.
Yep.
All right. Yes, I'm more explicit with that outside inside because that's very important for the power generation because then you can't get pushed. So if you go inside outside, you can get pushed out. Whereas obviously I want that energy towards the rim.
Right.
So yes, I would talk about the outside inside, but I'm not going to be super specific with things like where to put the ball, footwork being perfect, like, I don't know, like both facing the baseline, whatever, because it will emerge when they go against that scripted defender. And if they try and put the ball in front, well, the defender's going to knock it loose. So, and that's the biggest difference too. Like a lot of these trainers that you see and player development coaches showing all these things on Instagram and all this ridiculous stuff, like all this 1-on-0 reels and all that, giving all these specific instructions. Well, that's the best thing with the CLA approach. You don't need to, because players figure out if you're actually giving them realistic task representative cues in their practice environment. Players figure out the technique and what is most effective, and they will do very creative things which are best for them.
In another way of putting it, they self-organize and do what. And I was just thinking about another thing, and if we were in that discussion with the partner, if we asked the players, if you're under pressure going to the rim, would you want to finish off 1 foot or 2 feet? Keeping in mind that we're trying to work on the stride stop, which is a 2-footed finish. And then if we were to add constraints to it, or like tighten on more of a constraint, then maybe we would say you have to finish off 2 feet here. Like that's just a thought in order to keep going down that path without having to tell them exactly this foot has to go here, this foot has to go here.
No. You could then say you're playing a 3v3 in your practice after this. You could then say, all right, maybe every finish is a 2-footed finish. But then you just have to be careful of over constraining.
Right.
But in some situations, it's useful just to allow players to keep working at something and get more confidence from it. Okay,
so this is interesting. So you immediately you went to scripted here, which I agree, because it gives the athlete context. It gives them restrictions on where the other player is. So When it comes to working individually, like one coach on one player, would you rather do that or work in a small group setting?
Always small group.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about why that is? But Alex, I'm not getting the reps up that I usually get one-on-one.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing I changed coming into college with the player dev, moving away from individuals to small groups of 6. And typically it's positional pairings. So it's not just like guards. I mix everyone because the game is played with everyone. And especially with like 2-person actions like a pick and roll, they've got to be able to play with each other. It's critical. So yeah, I do have to think small group. An individual can be useful as a top up when we see a clear problem, where we see something needing to be fixed. For instance, especially with shooting, if there's a real problem with shooting. So what we've done at college is like, it's again, it's different based on all the players. Like 2 players who really need to work on their shot, instead of doing all their player development sessions with me, small group, they have like 2 shooting sessions and 1 small group with me a week. Whereas the players who have no problems with their shot, no errors, so to speak, they're all with me in the small groups. So again, it has to be individualized. And with the player development plans, I give the guys each month. For instance, last week, I did an individual with one of my players focused on just giving him more reps, being able to make one-hand skip passes off a pullback, because he was finding it very difficult and we couldn't get enough reps we could in the small group stuff, but I wanted to accelerate his development and get him confident with it. So we did that, and then we just did Euro steps because it had become evident that was in his PDP. He needed to expand his finishing solutions against bigger defenders instead of always relying, because he's 2 meters. He's always relied on just being the bigger guy and being able to get contact finishes. And now we've got to expand his package a little bit. So I did that when it's obvious what it is we need to work on. The problem is most coaches would go into an individual straight away doing stuff that the player doesn't actually need.
Right.
That's
right. Alex, can you go into a little bit of your approach on teaching defense? And like when I think of defense, Alex, I think of the shell drill, something like that. But it's a very interesting book that everybody might want to pick up is Doug Lemov's new book, which is The Coach's Guide to Teaching. Did I have that name right? I think it's The Coach's Guide to Teaching. Awesome book. Has a lot of references to different sports. A lot of it is soccer, which is very similar to basketball. One of the things that is awesome is that he puts the 4 phases of the game, which is obviously offense, you have defense, and you have transitional offense to defense, and then defense to offense, which is something that really struck a chord with me. Do you teach defensive drills, Alex? Do you teach strictly defensive drills like the shell drill, or do you take maybe I would want to call it a more holistic approach, which is more of I would say a games approach, because in basketball you do offense and defense rather than simply focusing just on defense? Is there a balance there, or how do you go about doing that?
So I haven't done a shell drill since I was 18. So that was 7 years ago. No, so that's the best thing when you do practices which have live defenders. Almost everything I do is offense and defense. I'm emphasizing both. Now, obviously, there's a limit to working memory, and you can't, for instance, talk about 2 things on offense you want to do and 2 things on defense. It's impossible. So maybe in one particular small-sided game, there's 1 offensive focus and 1 defensive one. Right? So, and this is my biggest problem with the player development and training world as it is now, that the defense is being totally neglected, like totally. And part of the reason for that is because most of the training is 1-on-0, just doing all these offensive moves, which I've never used in games. So, no, man, defense is done in everything I do. And it's just, I emphasize it in exactly the same small-sided games. So say, for instance, we're doing pick and roll, right? Let's say it's a 1v1 with the screener +1. This is something we do a lot, just to to get the handler really good at their setups and coming off. So constraints are, if the ball handler gets a reject, it's 4 points. If they get a bingo, which is where they attack in the space before the screen, it's 3 points.
Sorry, so it's like splitting the screen before the screen.
Before.
Okay,
yeah, exactly.
Yep.
If they shoot a pull-up 3, it's 3. For instance, if they get their defender into the screen and they get separation. And if they can't, they can turn the corner and finish at the rim. They just can't finish inside the charge circle.
Okay.
So that's like a game we use a lot. But think about the impact that has defensively too. Like, if your opponent's going to get 4 points when they reject and we're playing to 12 points, you are going to work like crazy to not get rejected. And then it's the same for the bingo. You're going to try and not let them bingo. So then basically what they're trying to do naturally is cancel the screen. So they get really close to them and then they try and slide over unattached so that the handler creates no advantage off the pick. And that to me is one of the most important concepts defensively. Pete Lonergan has some really good stuff on that with his avoidance, anticipation, agility stuff, the A's, he calls it, on ball screen defense. But, getting them used to that mindset of so many people now just focus on the coverages. And yeah, coverages are important, but can you build that ability to not get screened and to cancel ball screens? And naturally, my under 16s who are really good prospects, I'm hoping that, if they playing in the EuroLeague in 5 years, they'll be able to do some of this stuff because we've started at it from such a young age.
Cool. So what about things, again, a lot, I work in Hong Kong and in China. You may see other issues in Europe or the United States or Australia. What about things that may not be common sense to kids, like how to rotate? And this is going to depend on the coach's philosophy, obviously, on who rotates where and all that kind of stuff. But what about going into like giving them those concepts without solely being a defensive drill? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
No, absolutely. Well, like Chris Oliver did a great post on this, I think last week, in terms of teaching with musts. You can still coach, explicitly and say, this is what we have to do in this situation, of course. And like I do peel switching from Will Voigt. So I do peel switching with my team. And that's what I'll do next year with the prep team here. And of course, sometimes, that you actually do see players peel switch naturally. That's actually how Will picked it up, because it's what his players were just doing naturally.
Right.
But at the same time, it has an element of complexity to it. And of course, you've got to teach stuff like that, of course. And, well, a lot of things like pick and roll coverages, which I was doing last week, players aren't just going to self-discover everything. It is impossible. Right. And you're not going to be efficient if you're just like, all right, the players will self-discover it. It's not going to happen. But as I teach it, so to speak, I do it in an environment where it's a live situation straight away. So it's not on air. And I'm not going to be super detailed at the start and very technical. I'm just going to introduce the concept, let them get used to it, and then we polish it up. And that's kind of the main difference to how stuff's done in this way versus traditional. And like traditional would typically be blocked, not live. Whereas no, we would go live straight away.
I'm going to have him on at some point, but Francesco Rossi's book, who I just finished, he's a colleague of Alex's, and he came up with the book, The Conceptual Offense for High School Players. And this is interesting because at the end of the book, he writes that he doesn't have a plan, which in my opinion, I'm not sure if that's totally true, but in my opinion, you have to be a master coach to just start with the game, start with the and then see what they have to work on there. I really hope that one day I'm able to get there. But it's like what Alex is saying is you start with the game. Why wouldn't you start with the game, right? This is exactly what we're doing these 1-on-0 drills for, is for this 5-on-5 game.
Oh, yeah. Now, to be honest, Will, in the second half of the season, so Fra and I run the practices together for U16s. a lot of the time we start with like some type of 3v3 with different constraints, or even 5v5. And then we do like a 20-second huddle. And we're like, all right, what do we need to do? And I'll be like, okay, this is what I think. And we don't even talk about the small-sided game. We just talk about the concept. And then literally he will just go, or I will just go and just invent some type of new thing on the fly for whatever it is they need.
That is awesome.
And then we'll go back, after that, then we'll probably go back to the 5v5 or 4v4 and see if it's retained. And maybe we do something else.
So going back to all this trainer stuff, like one of the things, the reason I'm so passionate about this, Alex, is because I was one of those kids. I was one of the guys who was probably the king of stationary ball handling, dribbling 4 balls, whatever, anything you need. But when I'm looking back at what I could have been better at, or what we see every single day, I think one of the things that kids actually of all levels have a hard time with is handling pressure. Okay. And that could be individually handling pressure or as a collective team handling pressure. What are some of the things that you might do? Say you started a game, you see that, oh man, this team or these set of players can't really handle pressure. What are some of the things that you emphasize with them?
So first, you need to have ball control, and this ball control is far more important than dribble moves, because dribble moves, to be honest, you don't really see them much in a game. Like, I think it's important to have a counter, but to me, the most important dribble moves would be a cob dribble, keeping them on your body, like on your hip. Being able to dribble, with someone on your hip and stay straight line. A hostage dribble, which we see that a lot with like Luke and a drop coverage. A pullback, very important to create space against pressure and in the pick and roll. A push out dribble, where you take several steps in one and kind of throw the ball in front. A skate dribble, where you go laterally, several steps in one. And a counter, which is when they come in front, take away your straight line, you got to change. Those, to me, are key drills you need. I don't really teach stuff other than that because it's not needed. And yeah, I like moves like a cross jab. I think it's useful. But again, it's just the other things are way more important. Something like a cross jab is, that, all right, if there's like an ISO one-on-one guard and you're playing against the switching pick and roll defense, that's going to be useful. But it's like a 1% skill. Yeah. The other stuff of being able to create space with a pullback, do a cob or a hostage dribble, that happens way more. So I'm going to focus more on that stuff. And then maybe we sprinkle a cross jab into a workout for 5 minutes because it's cool for the players. They like it. But it's not something I'm going to plan my practices around or do for lengthy amounts of time. So I would just develop ball control through tag games. I have like 50 different tag games I use, which are awesome and they're fun. And you get to work on agility. It's great for a warm-up. Players develop their ball control. Then I do a bunch of different things for developing those dribble moves I just mentioned. A lot of the small-sided games would typically be 1v1s in tight space. So I have, you could, for instance, put them in a box, like in the paint or in a smaller box, and you're literally just playing 1v1, maybe one defender, no basketball, one offense. They got to keep the ball protected for 10 seconds. Maybe then you add constraints. You've got to face the defender the whole time, so they're not turning their back. Then you could do a gauntlet. I call it the gladiatore drill, gladiators, because obviously here in Italy. And it's like, a gauntlet with 2 or 3 defenders. And then I introduce different task constraints based on the Russell Crowe movie Gladiator. Okay. So it's stuff like, all right, now your right hand has been chopped off. You can only use your left hand. And just like stuff like that, which the kids find funny. And yeah, that's literally what I do for that. Really cool.
Really cool. So some of the similarities that you have is that in every single practice, we have at least one tag variation, and we have a keep away, rondo, monkey, whatever you want to call it, variation that we have every single practice.
Our kids are getting so good at it that now I don't need to do it as much.
Right.
They're good at it. And this is the thing, Will, there is so much to teach, and I'm a big believer. I am a believer in having checklists and curriculums, just because I like to be organized as a person. And sometimes I feel, I'm always thinking basketball, and sometimes it actually helps me relax because I know that I've got it covered versus just me having to remember it all up here. So I like it for that reason. But, you can never be married to plans and checklists and all this shit. And also, like, curriculum shouldn't be based on these moves. They should be based more on complexities and constraints, like what to do in the situation where a defender's on your hip. And yes, I have moves, like the dribble moves I mentioned. But the key part of it is actually listing the times when these things could be seen in a game.
Yeah. So another thing that I would add to that is you're absolutely right. And for me, it's the situation. It's if the player has seen the situation enough times, they're able to be cool under pressure rather than saying, well, you know what, we're going to start with this pullback crossover and having no context. But then I put them under a trap first. And then I asked them, hey, you're not really getting a great angle here because you're being boxed in. How can we get a better angle? I mean, you can't move left. You can't move right because the sideline's right there. There's a guy right there. What direction can we move? Yeah. And they slowly find this stuff out, which is
the next level to that is take that pullback example, reconnecting it where they can use the same skill in different situations. Yeah. And is master coaching. So it's like I was doing a pullback last week. So I started it in a 1v2 and they had to start on the baseline as if they'd just been trapped off an inbounds. And it was the offense had to try and get to the halfway and score a touchdown. Right. But obviously, because we've done pullback in the past, it was a great situation for them to use the pullback again. And it was a check for understanding and they succeeded because a lot of them were using it as opposed to just going head down, blah, blah, blah. But then I also went to a similar situation, a blitz off a ball screen where they could also use the same skill.
Really?
So I think that's a very important point to think about for coaches. How can you reconnect skills and give players a chance to maybe use the same thing in a different scenario?
Can you just go back and elaborate a little bit more? Because I think that's super important and something that Doug Lamov talks in his book. So okay, we have this move. We know it can be used when you don't have a great angle in a full court trap, whatever, right? But then it can also be used in a number of different other situations. How do you go about checking for understanding so that they actually understand that this can be used in a number of situations?
Yeah. So, and also it's just more fun,
right?
Because if you're working on the same skill in the same situation, it's boring. So literally just spicing it up, just putting the players in a new situation. Like, oh, okay. So no, checking for understanding is basically checking to see that the things that you've been working on are retained without you as the coach having to tell them what it is you're looking for. So say, take the pullback dribble. When we first did it, and we understood the context of when we're using it to create space in the when we're being pressured in our own half of the court. But then, each time we do it, I'm going to create different situations where they have pressure, and I want to see if they can do and use that skill without me reminding them about it. And that's what checking for understanding is.
Right.
So it's, can they do the skills at the right time and execute them without being prompted to do it?
Cool.
And I think that's the problem when a lot of coaches tell the players what they want and what they want to see, and they're actually depriving the players of a chance to demonstrate what they know and what they can do and what they've retained.
Right. Really important. Alex, you've been awesome in terms of being so generous with your time. Just last question, because I think this is all really great stuff that you've been talking about. When it comes to the subject of conceptual offense or like conceptual basketball, versus running sets and plays and all the very, very rigid kind of stuff. Can you talk about how you go about building a program or building a basketball team based on concepts, but at the same time having, I would say, guides or triggers for them to work and find different opportunities? What is the biggest difference, would you say, versus these two different schools of thought?
So conceptual offense, Will, is one of my favorite topics. So I'm always pleased to talk about that. Okay, so for me, have you watched Anchorman? Have you seen Anchorman, the movie?
Yes, of course, yeah.
All right. So to me, a good conceptual offense is like Ron Burgundy's jazz flute solo. You know, it's unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen next. It captivates the audience. It's in key. The notes sound good when they're mixed together. It, you know, it's exciting to watch and listen to. And I use this analogy because obviously I grew up playing saxophone. I still play. So jazz, I love jazz music. So I talk about this analogy of jazz versus classical. Now in Europe, we're more classical, we're more set based, and that's obviously a very, very effective way of playing. The NBA is more conceptual, way more conceptual, more jazz. But I think with youth, especially with youth teams, I think it's a problem when we try and go classical, because players are just learning these patterns and they're not actually learning how to play and how to have coverage solutions for each trigger. And obviously triggers are basically actions, but set plays are basically triggers, a pattern of triggers put together. That's what a set play is, right? But if you as a jazz player can know every trigger and how to use it well and how to make the defense wrong, when it comes to playing classical, you can do it and you're more effective. And it's actually a well-known fact in the musical world that classically trained musicians cannot really play jazz,
right?
Whereas jazz musicians are typically more diverse. And I think it's very much the same with basketball. And that's why I think that the conceptual offense framework is such a good place to start. Plus, I think it fits in to the reason I love conceptual is because it fits into CLA so well, with the fact that, you know, different players will come up with different solutions, as opposed to always doing the same thing off a trigger. Now, it's, you know, how would I describe conceptual offense in a basketball specific way? I'd say it's, you have a template and you have a base structure. So it's structured, but then you have moments of unstructured creativity that emerge from that. So to me, the structure would come from how you arrive down the floor in transition. So I am big on running habits and how we space the floor. But then once we get to that situation, we have, you know, a choice, a menu of triggers, whether they could be duets, 2-person triggers, or trios, jazz theme, or even a quartet, something like a stagger. And a solo, obviously, for the best players. Like, you know, your Steph Currys of the world need a bit of Miles Davis. So you have these different triggers, but anything could happen based on the situation you're in once you're in that situation.
Really cool. Really cool and really different from what a lot of people may think about when coaching basketball. I think this is something that everybody should dive a little bit into and learn a little bit more. Alex, last question. Can you tell everybody where they can find you and what's going on with you right now?
Thanks, my man. So literally, you can figuratively find me in Italy, in the town of Borgo Madero. Obviously, you know, a lot of coaches come and visit in the season. You guys can come hang out with Francesco and me. Instagram, Alex Sarama, Twitter, Alex J Sarama, and then basketballimmersion.com. Really
cool. They've got some great stuff going on over there, guys. Highly recommend you follow Alex. They've got some really good stuff. I've learned a ton, and you will as well. Alex, just hold the line. Guys, thank you for tuning in, and we will talk to you next week.